All right, good morning, Sunday breakfast with the coach. So hopefully everyone's going to start getting on board here, and I'll get to the matters at hand. More low-carb lecture stuff as promised. I've got a few lecture weeks left on the low-carb lies and politics for profits of low-carb diet books, etc., etc. So yeah, we'll just wait for people to get on board, and then I'm going to get right into it. So just gathering an audience. Let me know that you're out there, and when we get to enough people, I will commence. Hopefully everyone can see and hear me okay. So morning, Troy from Edmonton. You're the first one to check in, even though we've got double-digit people. So let me know you can see and hear me okay, usual thumbs and happy faces and all that, or just write in and let me know that, so I know that tech-wise we're working all right, and I'll take it from there. So hello, Linda from London. People coming from all over again, so this is great. So hopefully people are still benefiting from the low-carb Politics for Profits lectures, because I'm just looking at the series that I've gathered, and it's going to be several more weeks yet before I'm through it. So I hope people aren't too bored with things yet on the low-carb lecture front. Myself, I'm just tired of hearing it. So I thought I'd present to you some of the 20, 30, 40 years of research that I've come across and I've done myself, and try to put this nonsense to bed once and for all. So again, though, nutrition and diet, especially in North America, is a lot like religion. So it's once people are married to a certain religion, you preach sacrilege when you try to convince them otherwise. So as the old saying goes, everyone's entitled to their opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. The problem with the diet industry, of course, is they take facts and misrepresent them and skew them in order to present something that's not necessarily the truth. And that's what I'm going to get into today, is the misrepresentation of research and science by the low-carbers. And I'll get into the actual proof of that, just building an audience, waiting for people to come on board. So hopefully everyone's still happy with the subject matter, because I really want to get through it for the next few weeks before I get back to questions and answers and things on training and other research and things like that. So I know it's early for most people, or later if you're across the world, across the pond, as we say. So I'm just waiting. We got a pretty good audience, and what I'm going to do is, as usual, I'm going to start the lecture and then ask you to hold your comments, and then because I can't see the comment board when I'm looking at my lecture notes. And then what I will do is I will just come back. I'll pause every so often and come back to the comments and questions and take it from there. So hopefully everybody's gathering on board. I'm just looking at the numbers here. I wish they were a little higher, but I got a lot to get through. So hopefully you guys are all ready and willing, and if so, then I'm able, and we'll get right to the continuing argument of low-carb lies and low-carb nonsense. And in particular this week I want to get to the element of low-carb misrepresenting research and bad science. So I guess without further ado, I'm going to get right into that, and then I will pause every so often and come back to the comments section. So for now, I won't be able to see the comments for the first 5 or 6 minutes. I'll let you know when I'm back in the comments sections, and then by all means, folks, ask your questions or make your comments. So I'm going to get right into it. We're going to get right down to the elements of politics for profits and low-carb living, and there's several examples. I'm going to start with a quote from the director of Yale University's Center for Eating and Weight Disorders. He eloquently and accurately outlines the magical miracle formula used by diet books in order to become bestsellers over the whole last century. So we're talking 100 years. And he said the formula is pretty easy, and I quote, just promise easy, rapid weight loss, along with the promise to be able to eat your favorite foods, then add in some scientific so-called breakthrough or research science that doesn't usually exist, unquote. And I would add to that, get people to focus on short-term frames of 12 weeks or less, and to focus on the weight scale during that time as well. This is the sleight of hand magic trick that the consumer falls for again and again over the last 100 years and over as their own wish bias reframes diet nonsense within the context of the consumer's own hope over experience reality. Buzzwords are the key here, and the short-term emphasis. So I did a little reconnaissance mission while I was preparing for this. I looked at some of the more popular websites, like 10 times the followers that I have, in terms of the same kind of stuff. And what you see over and over again is a focus on short-term transformations, right? Some of the more popular sites, mostly with women. Look what Jane Doe's done in 8 weeks, and look what Jan Smith has done in 12 weeks, and and it's over and over every week, and everyone's on board with the usual "you go girl" stuff, but no one's had the temerity to write in and say, hey, on these websites, I noticed you post a picture of Jane Doe last year and her 8-week transformation. It's a year later. What's she look like now? What's she doing now? Post pictures of her now. No one's had the temerity to even think like that, and that represents what's wrong with this industry and what allows stupid fad diets like keto and low carb to thrive, because you get the consumer to focus in very narrow windows of time, not realizing that the majority of these people don't maintain these transformations. They don't sustain them. And then I end up the benefactor of that, because they abandon these websites and they write me in desperation and embarrassment because they've gained their weight back. So this social proof tactic works again and again and again. So I'm just going to mention something here, and then I'll provide you with a little bit of a lesson. Because still in most nutrition classes, the biochemistry that's taught is still the fact that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. So that's a quotation used and taught in many nutrition classes. How many of you have heard of the quote, fat burns in a carbohydrate flame? If you've heard that or haven't heard that, just write in some comments and I'll take a minute to explain it to you. So what that means in terms of biochemistry and things like that, the quote was made years and years ago, and it's still taught in nutrition classes. Fat burns in a carbohydrate flame means, let's say we all go camping for a weekend and we want to start a campfire. And let's presume that a big fat log in your fireplace or on a campfire, that is fat, okay? Now, you can't hold a match or a lighter under a big log and expect it to ignite, okay? It's not going to burn. You're not going to start a fire that way. So assuming by metaphor that a big log that you buy for your fireplace or at a campfire is fat. Fat burns in a carbohydrate flame means that if you're out camping and you have any experience at all, or even in your fireplace, what do? You go out and gather what we call kindling, right? You gather things that ignite real easy, little pieces of wood, little pieces of bush that can ignite really, really quick, okay? And you light them, all right? And then once the kindling is lit and going, you put the log on the fire, and then the kindling actually burns through the log. So that's taught even today in nutrition classes, and that is the phrase that fat burns in the flame of carbohydrate. So that's something that you need to know, you need to embrace, and you need to understand. It's a fantastic metaphor for how we burn fat, okay? And it's still true today. So memorize that. Fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. Think of the campfire analogy. No one ever in the history of camping held a match or a lighter under a big fat log and waited for hours for the log to catch fire. Just not going to happen. you use kindling, and the kindling ignites, the kindling makes the flame, and the flame burns the log, and that's why we say fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. So hopefully that makes sense to you guys. Any questions or comments on that before I resume? Show me some thumbs that you're understanding that. So it's a fantastic analogy, and I think it's something you guys should share, and hopefully you understand that. So perfect. There's a little delayed reaction here, so I'm just looking. You all got it. A very simple analogy to use, to remember, and even to be able to explain to other people. That's why it's so effective of an analogy to use. So I'm going to get back to that. I'm going to get back maybe to that later, but you can find that argument in, I think it's Understanding Nutrition by Catch and McCardle, an old textbook, nutrition book that's had, I don't know, 12, 15 editions. So that's very important. So I'm going to get to now the bad science misrepresentation front. The initial rapid loss of water weight that's typically experienced on low-carb diets has an additional benefit for book publishers and other hucksters of low-carb nonsense, okay? Back to my notes, so I can't see your comments for a few minutes, folks. You see, as people drop labile water weight in the short term, all right, they're more likely to tell their friends or to go on social media and to tell everyone how wonderful a diet is, right? Paleo, right, for instance. So by the time they've gained all their weight back and then some, as 95% of dieters do, they've already convinced other friends, family, followers, and they literally buy into the diets as well. This is called social proof, and this social proof tactic is a never-ending boon to low-carb promoters to keep people from focusing on short-term unstable weight changes instead of long-term metabolic compensation realities. All right, and as I said, some of the most popular sites in our industry I looked at yesterday, 10 times my following, right? And they focus mostly on women and mostly on anywhere from 4 to 12 week. Ooh, look at what she did. And no one follows up and says, well, a year ago you posted a picture of so-and-so. What's she look like now? So no one desperate to lose weight wants to hear about long-term reality and to take it slow. That's not sexy enough, right? They want to, and your consumer bias wants you to buy into short-term hype. So low-carb diets work well for this purpose, masquerading as reality when in fact it's not reality. So the reality for people who truly understand the biology of weight control and that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame, that reality, and here's a quote from the book Carbophobia, rapid weight loss is the $33 billion per year diet gimmick that keeps paying off. So over 100 years, you see the same things repeating over and over again. Buzzwords, words like quick and easy, and then of course when you advocate low carb, the initial water loss is very, very enticing. So people continue to want to confuse water loss with fat loss, as in, hey, as long as the scale is moving, I'm happy. I heard that argument over and over and over again. And people, as long as the weight scale is going down, they don't care about context. They don't care if it's water weight or whatever. So a lot of people will say they understand the difference, but they'll still opt for the quick, short-term focus, even if it's just to impress friends. So the American Medical Association concluded, and I'm going to quote here, because we're going to get to some of the faulty claims of low-carb and keto nonsense. The American Medical Association concluded, no scientific evidence exists to suggest that the low-carb ketogenic diet has any metabolic advantage over conventional diets for weight reduction. Let me say that again. American Medical Association in 2003, no scientific evidence exists to suggest that the low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet has metabolic advantage over more conventional diets for weight reduction. From Atkins on, many advocates of low-carb diets claim a metabolic advantage from dieting this way, but in fact there's no proof of that at all. So here's the reference for that. A critique, the research, a critique of low-carbohydrate ketogenic weight reduction regimens, a review of Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution, Journal of American Medical Association, volume 224, 1973. Now that's important. I included the 1973 because a follow-up study from Bravada et al., Efficacy and Safety of Low Carbohydrate Diets, a Systematic Review, Journal of American Medical Association as well, 2003. So what we see here is 73, 83, 93, 03, 4 decades, all right, showing there's no metabolic advantage of low carbohydrate diets over more conventional determinations of weight loss. So Atkins, in fact, had to stop making the metabolic advantage claim eventually because he kept getting called out on it, and he got into a lot of trouble with advocating low carbs to pregnant women, and I'll get to that in a future lecture. But my own experience also shows the exact opposite of metabolic advantage from low-carb keto diets. The worst and largest numbers of people I've helped with metabolic damage were almost always on some kind of low-carb diet previously, usually combined with endless junk volume cardio, as we see in female competitors. So I wrote my book, Metabolic Damage and the Dangers of Dieting, because diet research seldom touches on the experience in the fitness industry of how all this plays out in the long term. So I've seen the most metabolic damage and repercussions done from people who were previously trying to follow a low-carb diet. And now I'm going to get Atkins set the example of misrepresenting research and flat-out lying, okay, about it. Something his successors also learned to do, as in Gary Taubes, as in paleo, and the rest of it, misrepresenting research in order to skew back what they wanted to say. So the fact that Dr. Atkins' first book in 1972 had almost no research citations in it at all. But the final edition got smarter, and it had over 300 citations and references of academic research. But that looks good when you're selling something to consumers who never do any follow-up. But here's what the real researchers and academics had to say about that, and I quote, "The studies by Atkins to support his contentions were of limited duration, conducted on a too small a number of people, lacked adequate test controls, and used ill-defined definitions of diet." And that's from Friedman et al. The article is called Popular Diets, a Scientific Review. That's in the journal Obesity Research, 2001. And as Michael Greger pointed out in Carbophobia, and he's got substantial references of his own, and I'll quote him, "Of the few studies that did back up Atkins' claims, researchers show that some have seriously questionable validity, and researchers could not replicate the findings of the rest." And that's important in true academia. You have to be able to replicate what you're saying. So in fact, one review of studies that had previously defended Atkins' claims later concluded, and here's another quote, "It turns out that when these data are critically analyzed, they are often found to be in error, and it's therefore impossible to accept the validity of the conclusions derived by the authors from such erroneous data." Erroneous data. Okay, and that's in the book Carbophobia, page 13. Also the article by F. Grandi, Energy Balance and Body Composition Changes, a critical study of 3 recent publications, Annals of Internal Medicine. And then there's just the logistics of what is really going on in the early stages of following a diet like Atkins or any low carbohydrate or any diet that eliminates whole macro food groups. So since so many foods now become on the forbidden and banned list, people just end up in the initial stages eating less because they have less options and boredom and they lack variety. And while that works up front in terms of the law of thermodynamics, it can't be sustained either psychologically or physiologically. So remember things, if you've been around long enough, you remember things like the grapefruit diet, the cabbage soup diet, the nonsense of the HCG diet, all these things. So the real truth is that the initial excitement of early weight loss isn't so much about the magic of meats and the disaster effects of carbs. People are now just eating less in the initial stages for a while. And then while physiological effects of immediate water loss with carb restriction show up as weight loss, that's not fat loss. So water loss is labile, and labile just means fragile or unstable, and it's not going to last. So I often refer to this period of fad diets as honeymooning. Because in a honeymoon experience, you see what you want to see, and you glorify and romanticize everything. Everything is being wonderful, all right? So you romanticize in the honeymoon stage of a diet, you romanticize that diet. But in real and true metabolic terms, sustainable diet strategy is more about a long-term marriage. It's real, it's substantive, it's not dreamy and fantasy-based, overly romanticized experience. So remember, I talk a lot about the 3 realms of time that are important in metabolic optimization. The immediate realm of time, the residual amount of time, and the cumulative realm of time. And most of the diets want you to focus on the immediate realm of time. So I'm just going to pause there for some questions. Look, okay, so Ivan asked about someone promoting flexible dieting, if it fits your macros, tracking the calories. I'm not going to talk about what other people do or don't do. This series of lectures is about telling people about the risks and the lies of low carb nonsense. I'm going to get into that. I just wanted to pause. Are there any questions or comments right now for where I'm at? I'm going to take a little bit of a right-hand turn in the research. Everyone's still with me here? I want to get through all this. So, yeah, a lot of people want to come on my Sunday show and they want to ask me, well, this well-known person says this and this well-known person says that. I don't want to get into a pissing contest with people. I really don't care if it's not relevant to my argument. I've talked about if it fits your macros till I'm blue in the face. See my Smarter Sculpted Physique podcast for that. There's a lot of stuff that goes on there. So, okay, folks, so I'm going to get back to the lecture. I appreciate the thumbs and the hearts letting me know you're still out there. The numbers today are a little lower than what I would have hoped, given the importance of the conversation, but that's okay. You guys hit your share buttons at any time, and we'll get more people involved. So I'm going to go back to, and it's important, of course, that you all understand the honeymoon phase of fad diet, right? You got to get to understanding people love to honeymoon, whether they're competitors or not. They love to honeymoon about their coaches, about the diet they're following, about this and that. But real long-term metabolic truth is more about a marriage of sustainability, not romanticized fantasy that a honeymoon is. So that's very, very important. Another analogy you can keep in your head as well. So I'm going to get back to the argument. Okay, so now in terms of misrepresenting research, etc., there's also logical arguments that the low-carb people put forward. So there's the seemingly more logical low-carb argument that misleads consumers as well. Before Gary Taubes wrote his best-selling book, Why We Get Fat, which was an anti-carb book, he first wrote, I mentioned in a previous episode, a New York Times article reflecting the same dogmatic arguments as Atkins demonizing carbs. His first sleight-of-hand statement in that article was this, and I'll quote, "The very moment that the government started telling Americans to eat less fat, we got fatter." And this is a very common argument made by low-carb quacks and hucksters and enthusiasts. And this argument, on the surface, it seems logical. It seems to make sense. He then argues that since the percentage of calories from fat in the American diet has been decreasing and the percentage of carbohydrates has been increasing, then logically carbs are to blame for the obesity epidemic, don't you know? But hang on a minute here. One of my favorite uses of research, which I've told you guys about before, is to look at cross-cultural studies, the way people eat across cultures, and see what clues that leaves, whether historically or currently, and see what the effects of certain things I'm studying and researching have on a culture-to-culture basis, a more macro approach rather than the typical North American micro approach that studies only minutiae. When we look across the globe at other cultures, we see the thinnest populations in the world center their diets almost entirely on carbs. All right, and you can see T. Colin Campbell's book in 2014 for that. Especially rural areas where industry and fast food haven't penetrated cultural eating habits and the dinner table food fare, we see again and again carb-based diets correlate to thin and healthy populations. Let me say that again. What the research shows is we see again and again carb-based diets correlate to thin and healthy populations. There's no disputing that. These cultures tend to eat around 50% more carbs than most North Americans, yet they have a fraction of the obesity rates of North Americans. And in my book, Beyond Metabolism, I talk about if you go down to Central America and the West Indies, Jamaica, places like that, you'll see in the rural areas very, very lean people, almost meant to be bodybuilders, very good structure, have abs naturally, things like that. But as you get closer to the more metro urban centers, where there's now the proliferation of fast food, Kentucky Fried Chicken, McDonald's, etc., you see increasing obesity rates. But in the traditional areas where they still eat traditional fare, they eat a carb-based diet and they're all exceptionally lean. Getting back to Gary Taubes, he also, just like Atkins and just like paleo, he also manipulated his data and research in a very sly way. Now you need to follow me here because this is important, so pay attention. While the percentage of fat intake had been decreasing, overall calorie intake was increasing all across the board in North America during this time. This results in a greater amount of fat consumed, even if it's a lower percentage of overall calorie intake of fat. So if you're eating more than you've ever eaten, it doesn't really matter if it's lower in fat content. So anti-carb hucksters like Taubes want to blame overweight and obesity epidemic on low-fat diets that no one's really following it to begin with. So as an example, as I explained in more than one of my books, but Beyond Metabolism and The Anti-Diet Approach are two of my books that talk about this, 30 to 40 years ago, the average woman consumed about 1,500 calories per day. Now it's closer to 2,000. Actually, it's over 2,000. Okay, add that up. All right, so if you eat 500 more calories per day, 7 days a week, that's 3,500 calories just in a week. So how many calories in a pound of fat? 3,500. So if we times that by 52 weeks, that's 40 or 50 pounds. So the metabolism is actually doing a pretty good job for most people, even though they're getting bigger and bigger. It's actually because they're eating more. And you don't factor that in. And the other thing is during that same 30 to 40 year span, back then, women did most of the household chores of cooking, cleaning, childcare. There was less technological advancement, so it was more labor-intensive work back then, and that used up a lot of caloric energy and energy expenditure in day-to-day activity. So the amount of calories that were expended and burned daily from daily chores also dropped significantly over the same 30 to 40 year period where everyone began eating more. So what we have is a situation with more energy coming in and less energy being burned going out. That's just the law of thermodynamics. That equals weight gain. So to demonize carbs in this equation just doesn't make any sense. It's simple thermodynamics, okay? Adding calories while becoming more and more sedentary over years and years of time pretty much guarantees you're going to gain weight. So once again, when we look at the bigger picture, we have a different perspective and a whole new picture emerges with a different lens. It may be nice and convenient to blame various foods or macronutrients for your weight gain, but it's just not reflective of actual cultural reality and human behavior. 30 to 40 years ago, there was no such thing as supersizes and big gulps and Venti sugar, Starbucks fat, carb concoctions, and the people indulging in these portions and these kind of foods, they factor into the overall numbers that are presented in research as North Americans getting fatter. So it makes no sense to just blame carbs. And as I've always said, no one ever got fat from eating too many apples. So there's also research galore that shows Atkins and other related low-carb diets come in last when it comes to long-term weight control, which is what I talk about and which is what I support. One of the studies there is called Efficacy and Safety of Low-Carb Diets, a Systematic Review. And that's from the Journal of American Medical Association, number 289, 2003. So I'm not just speaking out the side of my mouth here. Remember, anyone can lose weight on any fad diet. Now, here's the important thing, folks. The question is long-term sustainability of both the diet and the weight loss. And what, if any, are the metabolic costs, repercussions, and consequences over the long term as well. That's the difference between fad diets versus healthy long-term diet strategy. And I see this even in the competitive world, right? Some of these websites that I talked about earlier, you go on, and I'm going to come back now to the comment section, but you go on these sites and you see so-and-so getting ready for a contest. Okay, so-and-so is getting ready for a contest. All right, they're usually dying in an unsustainable way. All right, it doesn't support the body. It can't be maintained long term. And everyone's going on, oh, you go, girl, this is so awesome. And meanwhile, they're doing a regimen that they can't sustain. All right, they're putting their body through something that can't be sustained. And then everyone's applauding that as something real and tangible. So everyone applauds the honeymoon experience, and no one's looking at applauding the long-term realities of the marriage of metabolic compensation system. So it even exists not just in the fad diet world, but in the competitor world as well, where we glorify the arduous contest diet experience, and we think of that as something, you know, healthy and helpful, and we applaud it without thinking of the long-term repercussions. And of course, these people can't sustain that weight loss and that leanness, and they end up gaining the weight back. And where's the pictures of them? Okay, there's the pictures of them 12 weeks later. Where's the pictures of them 12 months later? So that's the defining factor. So how sustainable it is. So I'll take a second here and look at, is there any comments or questions coming in? I'll just take 1 second, and then I'll go back to the lecture, and then we'll get to some nitty-gritty stuff. So hopefully you guys are finding this fascinating and benefiting from it. And all right, there's no comments. I'm going to get right back to it then. The problem with low-carb diets is one of the realities that over time, consumers continue to buy in an internalized romanticism when it comes to diet and weight loss. This is what I call the North American diet mentality madness. So while you say that you know that short-term weight loss is not the same thing as lifetime weight maintenance, you'll still do diets that offer immediate weight loss, and you'll romanticize your notion that you can follow such diets as a lifestyle over years and years. Even things like immediate things like diuretics, cleanses, laxatives, things like that. People fall into that trap just to see the scale move. So it represents, once again, the human emotional bias of hope over experience. How many people out there, for instance, diet for a vacation, diet for their weddings, that's a big one, for a high school reunion, and other short-term goals, maybe just for the summer to look good in a bikini or whatever, but no real considerations for long-term effects and consequences. And here's where the low carbs movement offers its biggest enticements, because that immediate water loss shows up on the scale much more dramatically than does a sound, holistic, unsexy, sustainable long-term approach. So once again, this is like honeymooning in a relationship with an abusive spouse. The marriage is eventually going to be disastrous. So that's very, very important. The other thing in terms of research is there's been very few studies looking at low-carb diets for long-term observation. Most of the studies of all diets tend to be short-term, and that aids the low-carb movement. In the early wave of low-carb hysteria, here's the exception, 4 year-long studies regarding Atkins, the low-carb shenanigans that began it all, every single one of these studies failed overall. 4 different studies that were long-term, every single one failed to show any advantage of low-carb diets over controlled diets by comparison. And that's in that AMA study I mentioned above. In the year-long study that compared low-carb Atkins to the Ornish diet, to the Weight Watchers diet, to the Zone diet, here's an important point. The Atkins low-carb diet came in dead last in terms of weight loss over the course of a year. Dead last. In fact, now listen to this, and I'll read it twice. More than half of the low-carb dieters in the Atkins group, they dropped out before the end of the year-long study. So think about that. So much for sustainability. People signed up, they classified them in the terms of what diet strategy they were following. More than half of the low-carb dieters in the Atkins group had dropped out before the end of the year-long study. Think about that. So much for sustainability. Ornish's high-carb vegetarian diet showed the most promise, the most sustainability, and the most weight loss. So here we go again. And the Atkins website, when presented with this, had no comment, no response. You can see T. Colin Campbell's 2014 book, and then the research I'm referring to here is 1 year effectiveness of the Atkins, Ornish, Weight Watchers, and Zone diets in decreasing body weight and heart attack risk. American Heart Association presentation, November 2003. Also, G.D. Foster, A.L., a randomized trial of low carbohydrate diet for obesity. That's from the New England Journal of Medicine, number 348, 2003. And then Stern, A.L., the effects of low carbohydrate versus conventional weight loss diets in severely obese adults. 1 year follow-up of a randomized trial. That's from the Annals of Internal Medicine, number 140, 2004. And Fumento, M., the article was called Fad Diet Failures. That's from the Scripps Howard News Service in 2003. So in short, in the few short years after the 1996 versions of the Atkins diet revolution, low-carb nonsense became a publishing bonanza, research was already starting to mount, showing very little evidence of viability or sustainability for low-carb living. Let's examine that. I just quoted you a list of studies that show, just in the few short years after the Atkins Diet Revolution book came out, all right, research was starting to mount showing very little evidence or viability or for sustainability of low-carb living. Remember, half of the Atkins people in the 1 year long study, half of them dropped out before the study was even concluded. And they didn't say that about any of the other systems of diet strategies. So very, very important stuff. In other research, looking at the diets of 10,000 Americans, true vegetarians were the slimmest, and while the people eating, listen to this, the people eating the fewest carbs or trying to weighed the most. So now let's think about that for a minute. Studied 10,000 people, a true representation. True vegetarians were the slimmest, while the people trying to eat the fewest amount of carbs, they weighed the most. Think about that for a minute. The people eating fewer carbs were generally more overweight as a group. The vegetarians simply were not. Researchers speculate vegetarians may have a higher resting metabolic rate because of eating more carbs than meat eaters do. Think about that for a minute. Here's the quote. Researchers speculate vegetarians may have higher resting metabolic rates because of eating more carbs than meat eaters do. So let's think about that for a minute. Adrenal function can be optimized from eating more carbs as well. For instance, at the same body weight, one study showed that vegetarians seem to burn more calories per minute just by doing nothing or even when sleeping than meat eaters do, almost 200 extra calories per day. And that's from M.J. Toth and E.T. Pullman, and the article is called Sympathetic Nervous System Activity and Resting Metabolic Rate in Vegetarians. And that's from the academic journal Metabolism, number 43, 1994. I call this, of course, optimized metabolism. And over time, this leads not only to weight loss and weight control, but effortless weight loss and weight control because of a trained metabolism. So this is just further proof that metabolism has to be fed, not starved, in order to be robust and healthy. It also points to the metabolic value of carbs. Adrenal burnout, chronic fatigue, almost all these things can be traced back to someone going on some kind of no-carb, low-carb diet fare and just frying their system. Now, does this mean you all have to become vegetarians? Of course not, but it does point to the value of the place of all kinds of carbs in the diet, including and especially starches, and their value for weight loss, for optimized metabolism, and for health and wellness. So again, that study, 1 year effectiveness of the Atkins, Ornish, Weight Watchers, and Zone diets in decreasing body weight and heart disease risk, from the American Heart Association presentation, and the other studies I mentioned from the New England Journal of Medicine. That was a 1 year follow-up, and the other two from the Annals of Internal Medicine and the Scripps Howard News Service. And then Popular Diets, Kennedy, A.L., Popular Diets, Correlation to Health, Nutrition, and Obesity, Journal of American Dietetic Association, number 1010, 2002. So I'm going to stop here for this week, but not before I make this point. The initial logical argument that Gary Taubes made was that at the very moment that the government started advocating people eat less fat, Americans got fatter. Well, now it's been more than 20 years or so since that point has been made. So it's been years and years since Todd's made the argument that ever since Americans were told to eat less fat, they all got fatter. Well, now, all these years later, Americans have been trying to eat less carbs for years and years, and guess what? They're still getting fatter. So I did a quick Google search of the research from 2015 to research as recently as this month, July 2017. The rate of obesity is still increasing, even though people are trying to cut carbs. So if cutting carbs was the answer, and people started doing that 15, 20 years ago, then why are people still getting bigger and fatter and more overweight? So the same argument that Todd's made way back when about fat can now be made about carbs. Low carb dieting is simply not sustainable in any kind of healthy way. So that's what I wanted to say for today, and that's it. So Matt wants to know, can I publish the studies for us to look at? Well, I can't really in this kind of format, Matt, because when I go to the comment section, I'll just be writing out studies, like 20, 30 studies. That's why I quoted them. So you guys can pause, you can rewind, and you can try to find them yourself. And again, I don't want to be doing everyone's research. I mean, it's almost ridiculous that people rely on people like me to do all the work. I went and found all this stuff, so you can too. But I do quote the research, so you realize that it's not just me waxing on about my opinion. I tend to have an experienced, informed, educated, academic, well-researched opinion, and that's hard to beat. And with 4 decades in the industry, 4 decades long, I can tell you that, what I see is low-carb dieting, or the attempts of low-carb dieting, doing more and more damage. And what the research showed that I just read to you is when you looked at it long-term, right, half of the Atkins dieters in a 1-year study, half of them had dropped out before the study was even over. So much for sustainability, but that's how this industry works. Get people to focus on the short-term realms of time rather than long-term sustainability. Like I said, yesterday I was disappointed but not surprised when I went to some of the more popular Facebook pages that are way more popular than mine, that focus mostly on females and often on competitors, and it was all, look what this person's done in 4 weeks, look what this person's done in 8 weeks, look what this person's done in 12 weeks, and no one writing in, it was all the comments were like, way to go, and you go girl, and blah blah blah, and no one had the academic reasoning to write in and say, well, last year you posted a picture of Jane Doe and what she did in 8 weeks. Well, now it's been a year. Can we have a follow-up picture? And then see what the sustainability of that kind of stuff is. So when we look at things through the long-term lens and the cross-cultural lens, the research shows something completely different. Not to mention that research that I quoted you in terms of the metabolic value of carbs, that vegetarians had the most robust, healthy, optimized metabolisms of those people who were studied, which is what you want. You want a revving metabolism, not a stalling metabolism. Those are things that are seldom talked about. So if you're going to lose weight, you have to lose weight in a good and positive metabolic context, or that weight's going to come back with a vengeance. So when we looked at long-term studies, a different picture emerges. So I don't pay much attention to short-term stuff unless it has some kind of context that's of value to me. So here I've shown you a ton of research that shows the ineffectiveness and lack of sustainability and viability of low-carb living or attempted living. Mostly what you see in this industry is we the sheeple, and like I said earlier, you see that diet is sort of like a religion. I'm an intermittent faster, if it fits your macros, I'm a keto person, and they put the blinders on and they only want to fake that opinion equals fact. And then what we do is we look at what the research actually says, and then people with open minds can go, maybe I need to reconsider these things. So, but what happens is you get all these people, as Sherry says, so much smoke and mirrors on those diet websites. And that's what happens. So you recruit more and more people with short-term stuff, and that's what sells, right? It sells coaching. It sells books, especially. It sells websites. It sells followers. And if you can do that, then you're in and out of the industry before any real damage is done. Because look at the research that I presented. Atkins' second edition, New Diet Revolution in 1996 came out. And then the research I quoted you didn't start till like 2002, 2003, 2004, 2005, right? So you've got that lag period before true academia and real research can catch up. But by then, it's already imprinted into the consumer's heads that this is something sound and worthy and blah, blah, blah. And then what happens there is people end up feeling like failures themselves when something that could never work from the beginning doesn't work. They don't blame the diet, they blame themselves. So, I recently, not recently, but several months ago, we had strength expert Dan John on the podcast, and he said something I found really interesting, and he's not a diet expert or nutrition expert at all, but he said if people want to make a realistic long-term weight loss goal, try to weigh 1 pound less every January 1st as a New Year's resolution. Just 1 pound over the course of the year. And that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. So you go to these websites that glorify competitors, they glorify and get you to emphasize short-term windows of time, and you remain blind to the long-term realities. That doesn't serve anyone. And yet I'm the one who gets attacked for pointing this stuff out. So, let me see here. So Tony's mentioning isogenics. I can't believe this stuff is still around, isogenics. Multi-level marketing, which again, I think it was Sherry who's also turned in, who said a while back, if the products that were in multi-level marketing really work, then why wouldn't the people selling them just sell them themselves and keep all the profits? Why would you need multi-level marketing? But here again is that short-term window. People convinced that something like a cleanse, 7 or 9 day cleanse, well, as long as the scale moves, that's that wish bias, right? They don't want to know the science. They don't want to know metabolic adaptations and metabolic compensation system. That's too much mumbo jumbo and real science for people. And yet it's people like me that are trying to help the consumer, right? But the consumer doesn't want help. They want the sexy, they want the sexy, what can I do today? Well, let's go back to the question on if it fits your macros. I've talked about this a million times. I'm sorry, I can't scroll up far enough to who asked that question, but there's more to things than the thermodynamics of calories in and calories out. So there's the qualitative element of how foods are digested, processed, and assimilated, okay? So 100 calories of a Snickers bar is not the same thing as 100 calories of asparagus or apple. They are qualitatively two different things. And to say that quantitatively is more important, eating 100 calories of a Snickers bar because you're on if it fits your macros, versus eating 100 calories of asparagus or apples, you're living in fantasy land, all right? Because what happens there are things that are non-nutritional that happen. You light up the reward centers of the brain, the opioid centers of the brain, and they want more, all right? It's like giving a drunk a sip of a shot of rye, right? Well, then they're just going to want more, all right? And no one talks about that stuff because if it fits your macros, it's okay. Listen, I want to leave you guys with something viable here. I want you to think about something that's going to get you jumping out of bed in the morning 5 and 10 years from now. And do you really think it's going to be going on your FitPal to try to squeeze in 100 calories of a Snickers bar? Do you really think that's something sustainable that you're going to be motivated to do day in and day out 10 years from now? Because if that's your level of motivation, I feel bad for you. I feel sad for you. I don't know anyone my age that I want to hang around who's involved in that kind of nonsense, all right? So there's the quantitative element of the fitness industry that keeps misleading people over and over and over again. So we've got to get past that, and we've got to start talking to each other and not at each other. But, I mean, that's in this day and age of the modern internet, that's just not how things work. So I'm willing to take your questions or comments, folks. Hopefully I gave you enough. I don't like talking too much each week. I don't want to lecture too long. I've got at least 8 or 9 low-carb lectures to go. I mean, I've got 10 years of research notes that I could continue to talk about this stuff, but I don't want to talk to myself. So if the audience isn't interested, I'll move on to something else. But Kimmy Carter says, I have a friend whose doctor told her to lose weight by cutting her carbs. Our doctor's now fooled on this as well. They don't get much nutrition training. You're right there, Kimmy, and it depends on the doctor, how busy they are, things that come across their desk. Doctors are schooled in medicine more than anything else, not so much nutrition. And they can fall into vogue trends. Remember, there's a lot of doctors that advocate certain diets. Atkins was a doctor, for crying out loud. So someone wrote me last week, actually, and said that her doctor was advocating the HCG diet of 500 calories a day, just as a start thing, and then to get things going. It's just, it's sad. But, I mean, they don't have the time to do their research, so they do what they think can sell and prevail upon the population. So it's unfortunate because it clouds what's really quite clear. So I recommend reading T. Colin Campbell's books on low-carb nonsense and stuff like that. And get off anything with buzzwords like secrets and easy and quick. Those are trying to sell you the sexy, the sizzle. They're trying to sell you the sizzle, not the steak. Things like isogenics and other, stuff, Body by V and all this other kind of crap that cycles every time, every 5 years or whatever. Just roll your eyes at. Perry's on board and says, any good GI doctor will tell you that some foods require more energy just to digest them. The colon is a big muscular organ. It requires energy to function as well. Celery, asparagus, and even potatoes require more energy to digest than does a diet shake. Again, qualitative stuff matters more so than the quantitative, and that's very, very important. So, I'm going to leave it at that for this week. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. Kind of disappointed in the numbers, folks. So when I do my announcements every week that I'll be live every Sunday morning, hopefully you guys will share and tell people to tune in and things like that, because there's no point in me just lecturing to myself. I already know this stuff and I already have done the research. So I'm trying to help people out there, so we really need to get these numbers up. Otherwise, there's no point in me being out here. So believe me, I get up at 3 in the morning on Sundays so that I can be down here at 5 a.m. my time to talk to you guys and try to impart a little bit of knowledge and 4 decades of experience to try to get people set straight. I don't like when I see numbers that are disappointing to me. I would prefer to see triple-digit numbers at least. So hopefully next week or on your own social media you can tell people to tune in on Sundays, or maybe it's just too early for people. That's fine too. If you have any kind of related comments, that's fine. Send them in and I'll be happy to look at them. So any final questions or comments? Cheat day for me. I started out with a loaf of banana walnut bread with butter, and then I finished with 3/4 of a lemon meringue pie and a quart of milk. So I'm all stocked up and fueled up, and as you can tell by that meal, I'm all carved up. So I know I'll have an optimized metabolism and I'll be ready to go. So my books there, folks, that I mentioned, Beyond Metabolism, The Anti-Diet Approach to Weight Loss and Weight Control, and Understanding Metabolism as well. And so hopefully you guys, you benefited from what I had today. With that being said, I guess unless some comments come in, I'll sign off for today, and I will see you guys next week. So thanks for being there, and by all means, please spread the word. I repost this Facebook Live on my YouTube channel a little later in the day once it's had time to square up. So hopefully I'll see you all next week. I'll continue on with my lecture, some interesting stuff next week as well, or at least what I find interesting and valuable and important. And we'll get to laying out the argument against low-carb lies and nonsense and sustainability of low-carb living. So that's it for today, folks. I will see you all again next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.